Was one of our book talk authors not that long ago for his book Paratrooper Generals. He is a former professor at the U.S. Naval Academy, is now an investigative archivist with the National Archives and Records Administration, and as I mentioned, is the author of Paratrooper Generals, Matthew Ridgway, Maxwell Taylor, and the American Airborne from D-Day through Normandy. So thank you for being here, Mitch.
Thank you, John. So, as you probably figure from my surname, it's not unusual for me to be last at a lot of things. Thank God for Susan Young and Kim Zemetis, or I would have been announced last at my high school graduation. But it's a thrill to be here and to talk about the Airborne. And you're probably thinking, oh no, another talk on the Airborne. We just had Steve's excellent talk, and the other talks also focused significantly on the paratroopers. But what I hope you'll take away from my talk, and there'll be some duplicative comments that have already been mentioned, but I hope that you'll get an overview of the Airborne because it was such an important component of D-Day. And before I get started, I want to thank someone who's in the audience today for influencing me and encouraging me to write this book, and that's Kevin Hemel. He's dead in the back with his hand up. He's got the brightest shirt in the audience, and Kevin is the preeminent patent historian. His trilogy is a must for your library. But I was talking to Kevin, and I said, I want to do a book on D-Day, but there's so much written. He said, well, there's a lot written on the Airborne, but nobody has tried to look at it from the big picture. And so he got me thinking, and I talked to my literary agent, and we said, well, why don't we focus the book on the two airborne commanders and sort of look at their influence on the airborne and how they commanded during the Normandy campaign. But as you'll see from the talk, I deviate from that quite a bit because as historians, we're trained to go where the evidence is. And anyone here in the audience who writes and researches, I think would agree with me that researching is far more fun than actually writing. And so I'll talk to you about some of the things that I found that I think were of interest to me and perhaps of interest to you. So the image here, and most of these images are from the Signal Corps collection, which is at the National Archives where I work. And of course, many of these were duplicated, and you can find them up at AHEC in Carlisle and many other places. But one of the questions that came up, certainly, and Steve addressed this, is, what were these guys thinking? What was it? What was on their minds? And I think this photograph is really telling. You have a few grins in the picture. And by the way, the paratroopers were placed together in what they call sticks. And generally, it was anywhere from about 16 to 18 men. And they bonded together through the training, and they were placed on the C-47s together. But looking at these guys, and of course, they're young, just like Steve's dad was at the time, 21. Some of them might be a little younger. Some of them might be a little older. And, many of them smoked on the ride over. Many of them prayed. I'd say all of them were nervous. And because of the jostling of the plane, especially when they got over Normandy and the flak, a number of them vomited. It was a horrific, but also, I think you could say, an exciting experience. And it also exciting for 2-year-old John Cornish. John lived in the village of Smearheath, which is in East Devon. It was right next to the Apottery RAF field. It was one of the fields that sticks of men from the 101st Airborne flew from. And I talked to John on a couple of occasions, and he described a house. It's not exactly this house in the picture, but it's pretty darn close from what he told me. And as a little boy, he would stand in front of the house. He said there was a garden there. And he would stand, and the men of pottery later in the day after training would walk by, and they'd pat him on the head and they'd give him candy. And they were on the way to the village community center where his mom, Mary, worked. His dad was elsewhere in England doing war work. And he remembered that. He's still alive and well today and a volunteer at a pottery. But what he told me is around almost midnight on June the 5th, he was sound asleep in bed, and his mom, Mary, just shook him awake, took his hand, and walked him outside of the house, and they stood in that same garden where he stood many times before, and he watched the planes take off. Now, that wasn't unusual for John because he had seen this many times before when they would do their practice run. And quite honestly, he said to me, I didn't really understand what I was seeing. It didn't really mean anything to me. It did when his mom explained to him the next day that these were some of the men that he had seen, the pilots, the other crewmen, some of the paratroopers, that there was a possibility he would never see these people again. And it wasn't until years later when he read up and understood what the invasion of Normandy meant and the magnitude of what he witnessed on that night really hit home for him. Oops. During the course of the research, I wanted to know, other than the obvious, why was the airborne so important during the Normandy campaign? Why was Band of Brothers made? Why are so many books on the airborne? And I started thinking about, well, how was the airborne covered during the invasion and even the lead up? And it was amazing to me the reporting that was done. And one of the guys that I stumbled on is this officer who actually was a war correspondent. His name is Wright Bryan. Probably never heard of him. He was a writer with the Atlanta Constitution before the war. He lived in Atlanta. He was friends with Margaret Mitchell, who, of course, is the author of Gone with the Wind. When the war came, he joined up as a war correspondent, and later on, he became a stringer for NBC News, which meant that not only did he write about the war, but he would give broadcasts. And as it got closer to what would eventually become D-Day of June 6th, he was asked, would he like to cover the airborne drop by actually going in on one of the planes? And no pun intended, he literally jumped at the chance. He said, I want to cover this. And a point that's important here is that General Eisenhower was incredibly transparent. He wanted the American people to know what was happening with D-Day. He wanted people to know about the troops. And he was like that throughout the war. And in fact, in the lead up to Operation Overlord, he clashed with Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Churchill was not as a big a fan of the news media as Eisenhower, and he didn't want the war correspondents to have so much information. And he had a clear reason. He was worried that some of that would be leaked, and of course the Germans would find out. But Eisenhower assured him that he had the right people in place and that as transparent as he was going to be, the state secrets weren't given away. So anyway, in the evening of, or the night I should say, of June the 5th, Wright Bryan boarded one of the planes. It happened to be the plane that 3rd Battalion 502nd Commander Robert Cole, later a Medal of Honor recipient, was on board. And Wright Bryan boarded the plane before they took off, and he started interviewing some of the paratroopers. And he came to this guy, Private Robert Hillman. And Bryan was a tall guy, and he had to bend over, and Hillman's already in his jump seat, and he's ready. The plane is starting to rev up. And he said to Hillman, "Are you worried, son?" And Hillman looked him straight in the eye, and he said, "No." And in quote, I know my chute's okay because my mother checked it out. She works at the Pioneer Parachute Company, which is in our town in Connecticut. And her job is giving the parachutes the final once-over. And Brian would write this. But during the course of my research, I looked at Brian's papers, which were down at the Atlanta History Center. And it's one of those aha moments for a historian. I found his notebook, the same steno notebook he used to interview Hillman and the others. And here it is. And you could see at the top of it where he mentions Mrs. Estelle Hillman at Holland Park in Connecticut and the Pioneer Parachute Company. So he kind of wrote those notes down, and that to me was very cool. So who were these airborne guys of the Americans? Well, reason I'm here today is I can credit General Bill Lee. Bill Lee from Dunn, North Carolina. He was in the Army Ground Forces before the war, and he worked his way up to a command post with the infantry ground, and he had studied the airborne. And once the war started, he looked into the airborne. He watched some of the German films of jumping into Crete, and he thought, you know, if we get into this war, we need to build our own airborne. And he got the ear of Chief of Staff George C. Marshall and convinced Marshall that the War Department needed to put a little bit of funding into the airborne. And eventually that funding grew once the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor. The statue of Bill Lee is in fact front of his house down in Dunn, North Carolina. You could visit the house. About, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, there was a news story that someone had graffitied the statue. And the story originally went that this was at the time of the controversy about Confederate flags and monuments, that somebody thought that was actually Robert E. Lee, and they desecrated the monument. Whether that's true or not, but it's been cleaned up since then. So the Army started recruiting paratroopers after Pearl Harbor. And one way they did this is to advertise. And they had a well-known artist by the name of Stagg put together this very evocative poster. And it was plastered in Army bases all around the United States, the commissary, it was at officers' quarters, the chow hall, you name it. But it was also placed in public buildings around the United States. And the idea was to recruit paratroopers. And if you wanted to be a paratrooper, you couldn't be any younger than 20, and you couldn't be any older than 30. Your weight had to be capped at about 185 pounds, and your eyesight had to be at least 20/40 in each eye. And when it came to your blood pressure, your systolic cannot exceed 140. So failure to meet any of these requirements meant disqualification. And then there was the training that took place. Much of it was down at camp, later Fort Benning in Georgia. And the men who were recruited or volunteered as paratroopers, and as Steve pointed out, they also got paid $50 extra. So if you were private, I think around the time you got $50, so you got another $50 in your paycheck, so you made $100 a month as a paratrooper. The training was grouped into 4 sections, A, B, C, and D, and it required the ability to run 5 miles, full pack, up hills. Some of the training also took place in North Carolina in those hills. The reveille started early at 5 a.m., and they would engage in full, intense training. Once you got past that, and if you could survive the heavy training, the intense heat in Georgia, which the descriptions of it were miserable, then you would start training how to fly in the plane. And one of the things that Lee insisted upon was some kind of jump tower. Well, he had heard about the jump tower that people actually paid to go on up in Coney Island, New York. He found out the manufacturer, I think you were there, right? And he bought one for the War Department, and they transported it down to Georgia. And the men would jump from there just to get a sense of what it was like. And then they learned how to load onto the planes, and then first they were taught how to jump out during the daylight. But then later on, they had to learn how to jump out of the plane with it being dark. And once you passed all that and you passed the coursework, you were designated a paratrooper, you were given your paratrooper badge, and your coveted paratrooper boots. So as the airborne started to develop, and we've talked a little bit about this already, there were airborne jumps in Operation Torch, which was the invasion of North Africa, airborne jumps also in Sicily and in Italy. In a sense, they were practice jumps for ultimately Operation Overlord. And as the war developed, Lee convinced Marshall into organizing a paratrooper division. And the 82nd Division was selected as the first one, the 82nd being a storied division from its World War I days. Everyone's heard of Gary Cooper, Alvin York, and the fighting in World War I. Well, the 82nd was reconstituted, and it became a paratrooper division. Eventually, it was, I'll jump ahead just a second, it was taken over by Matthew Ridgway. Ridgway was the son of a career Army officer, desk officer under George C. Marshall in Washington, who begged for a field command and eventually was placed in the 82nd, and eventually he became the division commander. And by the way, I should point out that my friend John McManus is being very modest today, but he's in the midst of writing what I believe will be the definitive book on Matthew Ridgway. So stay tuned for that. Ridgway was quite the character, tough guy, and he developed the division as a airborne division, even though he had no background in it. Eventually, the 82nd was split off, and go back one here, and the 101st Airborne was created. Now, Maxwell Taylor, son of a country lawyer from Missouri, you've probably known more about him during the Vietnam War as an aide to President Kennedy. But he was in the 82nd Airborne, and he was Chief of Staff to Ridgway. General Lee, who I introduced you to, was actually the first division commander for the 101st. Unfortunately, when the units moved over to England, Lee had a heart attack. He had a bad heart, and despite his defiance, General Eisenhower brought him back from England, and he recuperated back home, excuse me, but his health was not good enough for him to command a division. Eisenhower looked around for another division commander, and Taylor took over the job. Another reason that we know so much about the Airborne is this guy, Colonel Barney Oldfield. Now, you may have heard that name before if you're a race car fan. I don't know for sure whether this Colonel Barney Oldfield and the race car driver by the name of Barney Oldfield were related, but this Barney Oldfield would at least like to brag about that, and he knew the race car driver. And he's someone within the story that I really fell in love with. Oldfield, before the war, was a writer. He did movie reviews for Billboard magazine, lived in the Lincoln, Nebraska area, and eventually joined the Army Reserves. And then during the war, he became a young officer. He was assigned to one of the paratroop regiments of the 82nd Division as a public affairs officer. As the war went on, eventually he became part of Eisenhower's SHAEF staff, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. And Oldfield had an idea, and he pitched this to Eisenhower, and Eisenhower agreed. Now, you had Wright Bryan, who flew in one of the C-47s, but Oldfield had a better idea. Not only would the war correspondents fly in the planes, but they'd actually drop along with the paratroopers. They'd be on the ground, and a term we use more today, they would be embedded with the regiments and go with the troops. And so he put out feelers amongst his friends in the war correspondent pool in London, and he got a number of takers. They were all told that they had to go through the same paratrooper training, the same 10 weeks as the airborne. And so several of them signed up. A couple of them didn't make it, but they went with the airborne units on the night of June 5th and jumped in. One of them was a guy named Bob Rubin. Rubin was a reporter with Reuters magazine, and he got down on the ground and he had a carrier pigeon, wrote his dispatch about what he saw, put the dispatch in the carrier pigeon's, the little tube, and then threw him. The pigeon went over the English Channel, made it back to England, and Rubin's story was filed. Another reporter by the name of Bill Walton, no relation to the UCLA and NBA basketball star, but he carried a typewriter that was tucked into his parachute strap. Here we go. So what was the mission? It was part of Operation Neptune, which included the amphibious landings. Well, there were 13,000 paratroopers, and I'm only talking about the 82nd and 101st, the American Airborne, and they were going to fly in 800 C-47s. John went over this a little bit, but the idea was to secure the roads and bridges inland from Utah Beach, disrupt the German forces, or, as you pointed out, chaos, and then link up with the 4th Infantry Division that was coming ashore. All of this was planned out over months. In April of 1944, there was a huge airborne test, and was viewed by Eisenhower and Prime Minister Churchill and a number of other dignitaries. As we got closer to the actual date of what would be D-Day, which, as we know, was changed to June the 5th, Eisenhower became rattled. And that was from Air Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory. Mallory, as been pointed out by our first speaker, was very spooked about the airborne. He felt that there were going to be significant casualties, that these poor guys, if their C-47s weren't shot out of the sky, and these guys were able to, these paratroopers were able to make it out of the plane, they were going to get shot out of the sky. And he was throwing huge numbers, 50, 60, maybe 70% of the paratroopers were going to die. Needless to say, it also spooked Eisenhower, and we talked about this. He met with the two division commanders. They met with Bradley, the Corps commander Collins, and even Montgomery voiced his opinion. All of them agreed that if Utah Beach was going to be one of the landing beaches, they had to have the airborne, and it could not be canceled. Lee Mallory pushed this a couple of times, the last time literally a few days before D-Day, and that was when they found out that one of the elite German divisions had actually been transferred right dead in one of the drop zones of the 82nd Division. Well, Eisenhower took this information with him, went back to what he called his circus tent in Portsmouth, and he mulled over it, no doubt, probably with packs of cigarettes and a Louis L'Amour dog-eared cowboy novel next to him. And he thought about it, and he realized this is a risk, but we need to take it. And he agreed that the Airborne would be a go once D-Day was launched. The Airborne was under the 9th Carrier Command, led by Lieutenant General Lewis H. Brereton of the 9th Air Force. Brereton was somewhat of a character, a womanizer, a hard drinker. He, in some ways, was kind of like Billy Mitchell of the First World War. Under him are the Douglas C-47 Skytrains, 2 Pratt & Whitney engines. The Skytrains were actually Douglas DC-3 aircraft that were the first really commercial aircraft to transport civilians. The military got a wind of these and ordered a bunch of them from Douglas. And then next thing you know, the aircraft manufacturers are springing up all over California, Arizona, Nebraska, and elsewhere. And just like the ships that we saw being built by Beth Steel up in Baltimore and elsewhere, they were pumping these things out. But they also needed something that was going to transport the equipment. And so the British had been experimenting already with gliders. So it was decided by the Americans to also adopt gliders. And a huge contract was given to the Waco Glider Company, or the Waco Aircraft Company, in Ohio, and they produced the gliders. And they would come later in the day and the next day delivering some of the men and some of the equipment, the heavy equipment. Also known as flying coffins. On June 6th, the highest ranking officer in the American Army, Don Pratt, who was assistant to Ridgway in the 101st, was coming in fully loaded when his plane skidded on the ground while being shot at by the Germans, kept going, crashed into trees, and everybody on the plane was killed, in addition to Pratt. On the night of June the 5th, these are some of the things that the paratroopers carried as they were loading into the C-47s. They had the Mae West flotation devices, which you can use your imagination when they were inflated. They had maps, they had hand grenades, compasses, entrenching tools, canteens, knives, the issue Tommy gun, pistols, ammunition belts, first aid equipment, and Americans had 2 parachutes. You had your main and your reserve. The British Airborne only had the main parachute. One paratrooper I read about also carried a couple of bottles of Schlitz beer with him. Now, it's my opinion that Schlitz beer is some of the worst out there, but I imagine once you've landed and you're happy, it probably tasted pretty darn good. So the airborne route across England into to Normandy went like this, and I'll read to you from one of the operational manuals. So the planes took off in serials, the VAVs that Steve talked about. They rendezvoused about 20 miles east over Birmingham, England, and then eventually worried about collision. Keep in mind, it's dark out. They have radio silence. The planes formed the perfect VAVs as they joined the rest of the airborne armada. From this point, the serials of each wing would fly 60 miles southwest to the head of the Severn Estuary. From there, they flew another 60 miles to a command assembly point, codenamed Elcho, where their naval vessels, and these are British naval vessels, helped guide them with navigational aids, and they would signal the planes that they were over the correct location. Next, the pilots veered their planes south-southwest to the command departure called Flatbush, which was on the tip of a sandy cape called Portland Bill. And then at this point, once all the planes met there and they made the correct navigational ability, the planes flew straight over the channel for 57 miles, where they reached another navigational point called Hoboken, which consisted of more British ships. They were MTs, or motor tank boats, and then they were on their own to head towards Normandy. We've seen these maps already, but it gives you a really good sense of where the paratroopers were going to land in their DZs, their drop zones. And you can see that they were spread around. Now, while the paratroopers were at the RAF bases in the days leading up to what would be D-Day, the bases themselves, they called them marshalling yards, were completely sealed off. It meant no one could enter and no one could leave. And each of the sticks would stand over what looked like child sandboxes. And in the sandboxes were mock-ups of the villages that they hoped to see near their drop zones. And they practiced and they looked and they saw where the village and where the headquarters were going to set up. But not only did each stick have to know their own drop zone area, but they were also required to know the drop zone areas of the other sticks. Last minute check, again, just giving you an idea of what these men looked like as they were boarding the planes. In some cases with the equipment, it was anywhere between 70 and 100 pounds over their weight. Leading the way were the Pathfinders, which was developed after some of the disastrous jumps in the Mediterranean in 1943. So the Pathfinders trained the same as the paratroopers, but they were also specially trained, and they would drop 30 minutes before the main body of the paratroopers, and they set up navigational aids near the drop zones, compass beacons, colored panels, Eureka radar sets, and colored smoke. John mentioned a little bit about Eisenhower's visit to Greenham Common to visit the 101st. So as you can imagine, Eisenhower was still very uptight about the paratroopers after having been spooked by Lee Mallory and worrying about what was going to happen. He originally wanted to visit both the 82nd and the 101st. Ridgway did not want him to come to the 82nd Division flying fields because he was worried that it would cause the men to be a little bit more nervous. It would just disrupt things. But he was invited by Taylor, and he went, and he walked around, talked to the men, talked about fly fishing, about where they were from, and then he watched as each plane took off. He had had dinner with the men, and he sat up in a stand watching the planes take off along with General Brereton and his driver, Kay Summersby. A newspaper reporter who was on site said as the last plane took off, he could see tears rolling out of Eisenhower's eyes. And here again, another image of these men as they're getting ready to take off. And once they reached Normandy, a variety of things happened. Some of the men, mostly the ones in the 101st Airborne, made it at least close to their drop zones, but many of them landed in hedgerows, cow pastures, villages, and marshes. The cricket that you see here that you could buy in every one of the gift shops in some Mericles were primarily carried by the men of the 101st. To my knowledge, they were not issued to the 82nd. The Ridgway's concern is that they might fall out of their pockets and they would just turn out to be useless. There's various stories about what happened to the men as they landed. And I'm going to read you the accounts of General Taylor and General Ridgway. Taylor would write in his book, his memoirs, that he came down with a bang in a small field close by one of the famous Normandy hedgerows. He struggled to get out of his parachute, and he said, I expected that some of my men would appear to help. But when I looked around, not a single American soldier was in sight, only a circle of curious Norman cows who eyed me disapprovingly, I thought, and as if they were resenting the intrusion into their pasture. Taylor continued struggling to remove his chute, and when he heard German guns open up in the field, he was able to drop down, run, and eventually catch up with his men. Matthew Ridgway had a similar experience. He too landed, and he landed in a soft, grassy field. It was dark. He grabbed for his .45 pistol, but it slipped from his hands and tumbled into the grass. In the darkness, he said, he pawed around for the weapon when he sensed a nearby movement. Nervous, Ridgway called out the password, "Flash," and anticipated a response of thunder. But there was only silence. To his great relief, though, Ridgway realized the movement was from a cow. "I could have kissed her," he recalled, but he meant that the pasture, because to him it meant that the pasture was not mined or booby-trapped. During the course of the day, we talked about the 82nd Division was charged with clearing some of the causeways. No more important causeway was in Saint-Mère-Église, one of the towns that was important for the 4th Division, to be taken for the 4th Division to come and be able to break out from the landing beach. And it was a seesaw battle all day, fighting in the town. Much of the town had been ablaze earlier from a stray bomb that hit one of the buildings. You could see a church steeple here. Of course, from the movie and from Cornelius Ryan's book, The Longest Day. Red Buttons, John Steele, landed at the church. There's some dispute today by historians who doubt that actually Steele had been caught up in the steeple and laid there. Each year I go over with tour groups who pay a fair amount of money, and they like to look at the dummy that's still there. I don't say a word because I don't want to ruin their vacation. The 101st Airborne gathered their troops, and they set off on their missions. The two main ones were to liberate Saint-Marie-du-Mont and Carentan, which was a dairy area where Carnation had a dairy farm. Both of those towns were liberated, but not without heavy fighting throughout the day. So to summarize this, Lee Mallory's prediction that these men were going to get shot out of the sky, their planes were going to get destroyed, and that the airborne landing was a disaster. Well, when first word came in that the troops had landed and that it looked like casualties were relatively light, one of the first things that Lee Mallory did was contact Eisenhower and apologize to him for putting him in such a frightful mind. And you might be wondering, whatever happened to Private Hillman? Did he make it? Well, he did. Whether or not it was his mom's packing of his parachute, we'll never know, but he did land. He did fight with the 101st that day. He was wounded at Carentan, so he was out of service for a few weeks, but he rejoined the 101st, and he fought with them at Market Garden and also the Battle of the Bulge. He came back to Connecticut, and I spoke to one of his daughters, and she said that her dad had a really rough time. He had changed jobs a number of times, and he eventually left the family, but he could still be seen riding around their area on his bicycle with his paratrooper boots. So to sum up the legacy of the Airborne, and by the way, as you know, the Airborne continued on not just from June 6th, but fought as infantry and stayed in Normandy until about the middle of July. Of the 13,100 airborne troops, they were carried by 800 C-47s. There were 100 gliders, 3,900 glider troops carried over by 5,700 Air Corps crew. During the whole Normandy campaign, more than 1,000 died, about 340 just on D-Day alone. Another 2,600 were wounded throughout the campaign, 900 on D-Day, and a number of them, more than 4,000, went missing, most likely captured. Some of them were able to escape. And if you feel like you came away from this talk a little bit cheated, didn't learn enough, I recommend this book. I know the author, and he's relatively reliable. So thank you. So I think it means we have a little bit of time for questions.
How many of them survived, and was it really worthwhile that they landed before unhindered and were able to lead some of the major organizations into the drop zones?
I don't know the exact number of the Pathfinders who actually dropped. It's in the book, but nor do I know the exact number that were lost. And I think the Pathfinders played an extremely important role. Certainly, they helped guide the planes. As we've talked about before, a number of the planes went off course. They had to drop them in much lower than was expected. A lot of that had to do with the poor visibility and, of course, being shot at by German anti-aircraft. Years later, and I think not to keep ragging on Stephen Ambrose, but the pilots were unfairly criticized for flying off course. And I don't think it had anything to do, I should say that some of the Pathfinders had trouble finding the exact area. But I think it was important. I don't think it was certainly a waste of time, but it was certainly an important element of the Neptune operation.
Which division, percentage-wise, took the most casualties?
I believe it was the 82nd Division, largely because some of their men dropped into swampy area that had not been detected by the reconnaissance flights. And as Steve pointed out, a lot of those men, because of the heavy equipment, went straight down into the water and did not survive. Thanks. All right. No, you got. There's a.
I can quickly answer the question of which had the most casualties. 507th had a 61% casualty rate. However, still the British general is wrong. Most of those casualties were because the 82nd was asked, and the 507th in particular, was asked to do things they weren't equipped to do after D-Day. That is to say, they were asked to pass through other units that were struggling, and they went up, for example, Hill 95, which when they didn't have the equipment to, many of the battalion commanders almost revolted about the issue that they're going to lose too many men, which they did, but they did accomplish their missions. But it's basically General Bradley and General Collins felt that the 82nd and the 101st were so superb that they wanted to move, and so they used them. So they used them in things that they were, in operations they weren't supposed to do. But the question I wanted to ask was, you have General Ridgway as the commander of the 82nd. Of course, he is. Yeah. But if you ask most people, who would they say is the commander of the 82nd?
Well, Gavin, perhaps.
Gavin, right. So did it bother General Ridgway that General Gavin became kind of identified with the 82nd rather than his?
I don't think so. And part of my reason is I posed this to John McManus at some point, and I asked if there was much of a rivalry between the two. And if I'm correct, John, there wasn't. They got along. Gavin is a fascinating story, by the way. There's a wonderful biography of him. I can't remember the two authors, but you could find it fairly easy. He had a rough going in life. He was adopted, and according to him, he had gone through a lot of child abuse while he was living in Mount Carmel, Pennsylvania. But no, I don't get the impression at all that Ridgway was that type of commander, nor Taylor for that matter, that they were looking for some sort of gratitude. They were looking for some kind of heroism. I do get the impression that Gavin was. I've read letters that he's written well after the war, being very critical of Eisenhower and others, and I think there was a bit of jealousy on his point, or his part, I should say.
Is it true that during the Battle of the Bulge, when Bastogne was besieged by the Germans, that the 82nd was not parachuted into the area, but actually trucked in?
That's correct, yep.
Were those soldiers resentful that they didn't jump?
I don't think so. They had just, they had a tough go of it in Market Garden only a few months before. They were actually in reserve. They were kind of licking their wounds. They were exhausted after the Normandy campaign and then later on in the fall. So no, I've never read anything where they thought, why didn't they put us? Also, if you know anything about the Bulge, and we have a veteran of the Bulge here, he could tell you the weather was just horrible. I mean, they could not get aircraft to just deliver supplies or bomb, much less drop paratroopers.
What did what happened to the people who got killed in Normandy? Were they buried right away? Where, do you know any of that information?
That's an excellent question. So yes, I wouldn't say they were buried right away, but when there was a lull in the fighting, there were Graves Registration Service units, and they were often led by a chaplain and volunteers from the units, but they did this meticulous job of tracking where the men went down. What helped identify some of them, we heard an account of soldiers really being blasted to pieces. Their ID badges, their ID disc, which are affectionately called dog tags, that was essential. So they were buried in temporary cemeteries, and they were called communes. And then after the war, it was decided, and the families made the decision of whether or not these men would be buried in what became the ABMC cemeteries, or at government expense, they would be brought back to the United States. So I know in the First World War, about 40% of the families left their loved ones overseas in the cemeteries. I don't know the exact number for World War II. And there were, I should say, some of the men were also buried in French cemeteries. Some of them ended up, or in Belgium, depending on where they died, what country, and some of them ended up in British cemeteries. But the War Department did the best to repatriate them and place them in American cemeteries.
Me again. I just want to give you some food for thought, and this will link in with a question raised this morning about air support. England is about the size of Virginia, give or take a few square yards. England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, about the size of Idaho. In that space were living about 40 million people. Now, just jumping away from D-Day, think of a 1,000-bomber raid over, say, Cologne. You've got to launch all those bombers very quickly if they're all going to arrive at the same place at the same time. And they probably launch their bombers in sticks of about 20 from each airfield. And that's why if you go up the A1 on the east coast of England in an aircraft, say to Edinburgh, you will see airfield after airfield after airfield, because you needed that to get all the bombers in the same place at the same time. We've just heard about 800 C-47s. There was air cover, there was bombing. I suggest one of the limitations was runway. We didn't really want to concrete the whole of England, but runway was a big limiting factor, I feel, in getting all those aircraft in the same place at the same time.
Well said. In fact, Greenham Common Airfield, where I showed you the photo of Eisenhower and the men from the 101st, had the longest runway. But that is an excellent point. That was a major concern when they were placing the airborne units.
Can you comment on the quality of intelligence and reconnaissance in prepping the landings, on understanding troop concentration or enemy troop concentrations, terrain, and various things like that?
By and large, it was very good. There were intelligence summaries that were issued weekly through SHAFE G2 and disseminated amongst the various levels of troops. And as I was saying, in the marshalling yards, they had these sandbox type of setups, so they knew from the reconnaissance, the flyovers from photographs, exactly what the beaches looked like. They knew what the villages looked like. Where there was the failure, though, with the 82nd, and that is not recognizing the swampy area around the Miradoret, which had been flooded by the Germans. So, and that was a major problem. But by and large, the intelligence, I believe, was very good. Yes?
Several speakers have mentioned Band of Brothers today.
Yes.
And in the program, after the landings and airborne is moving across country, obviously they need to move quickly. But German prisoners are taken in the program, to be fair. I'm curious the veracity of the program suggesting that those prisoners were shot.
Certainly there were instances of that happening, but going back again to General Eisenhower, who I'm getting to know very well based on a book I'm working on, that was against not only the Geneva Convention, but it certainly was against American protocol, and soldiers were dealt with. There was a book that came out, oh God, probably 20-some years or more ago that claimed that Eisenhower was privy to mass shootings of German POWs, and using Stephen Ambrose again, he and others investigated it and determined that that did not happen. Certainly there were instances where, and I remember what you're talking about from the TV program of German soldiers being shot, and I think it certainly happened, but it wasn't wide scale. It certainly, I think, probably happened more Germans. I mean, the most famous we think about is the massacre that happened in Normandy and the crossroads there during the Battle of the Bulge.
On the question of shooting German prisoners, in reading the unpublished memoirs of many of the men of the 507th Regiment, I was surprised. Quite a few of them said they did.
Okay. Whether, yeah.
A lot of them said, I wish it hadn't happened, but we were just moving on. We were just moving on, and we couldn't stop. So I was quite surprised to read this.
Okay.
Hi, I'm curious to know what you feel are some of the greatest specific achievements of the airborne on D-Day. And I want to mention one that I've really liked to think about over the years. I was on a tour in Normandy in '94, and some veterans were on that tour from the 82nd, and they told me they were present when the 82nd ran into a German general and killed him. This was a lieutenant general. And, you know, this must have really disrupted some of the German efforts at the time.
So you're asking what I think some of the greatest achievements were? Well, certainly the taking of Saint-Méricles, Chef du Mont, which was near Lafayette, and taking Lafayette Bridge, which actually didn't happen on the 6th. It took a few days. The taking of Carentan, I mean, it was miraculous of what the airborne were able to do, and especially in the case of so many of these men landing so far from their drop zones and having to spend a good part of the day regrouping and forming again with their units. So I would say that those were the top. And then, of course, Dick Winters taking out, and his men, the Band of Brothers, taking out the guns that threatened Utah Beach.
Okay, thanks, Mitch, very much.